wherever he went. Let's see. Ludwig Wittgenstein said that Kierkegaard is by far the most profound thinker of the last century. Kierkegaard was a saint. So this is a sketch of Kierkegaard, and I'd like to start just giving a little information about the life of Soren Kierkegaard. So, Kierkegaard said that what I really need is to get clear about what I must do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find a purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. The crucial thing is to find a truth which is truth for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. This is what my soul thirsts for, as the African desert thirsts for water. So this does a good job summing up what it is that Kierkegaard was attempting to do with his body of work in philosophy. As we'll find moving forward, it's really difficult to identify what it is really that Kierkegaard believes and what he doesn't believe. But from everything I've read, this excerpt does a good job of summing up his life's goal. He was born on the 5th of May in 1813 in Copenhagen, Denmark. Soren is actually Danish for serious, and Kierkegaard is Danish for graveyard. So his name actually translates to serious graveyard, which is kind of a funny premonition for what the future of his life is going to look like. You see, his father told him that he'd inherited a curse. His father, Michael, cheated on his wife with his maid. And this maid ended up being Soren's mother. He was conceived out of wedlock, and his father was a really pious man. He believed that because of this, God had placed a curse on him. And God says that whatever curse is put on his father, any curse that is put on a man will be spread to his children. So he believed that all of his children were cursed as well. And he said that all of his children will die before the age of 33. Because this is the age when Jesus died. Who knows really why he decided this, yeah? But it turned out he was almost correct. So of Soren's father's children, Soren's siblings, there were 7 of them in total. 5 of them died before the age of 20. Only Soren and 1 brother lived beyond 33. And Soren died at the age of 42. They all died very young. After Soren and his brother turned 33, they both sent congratulatory cards to each other to say, "Hey, we did it! We beat the curse! Good job!" And then 9 years later, they died. Throughout his life, Soren was known to do something called people bathing, where he would go out onto the streets and he would try to engage with conversations with anyone that he could meet. This is something, if you've studied the history of Greek philosophy, something really common that Socrates has done. And Socrates was a huge influence on Kierkegaard. Going out onto the street, just engage in debate. And oftentimes, Kierkegaard didn't really have a firm argument that he was trying to fight for. Instead, he was just trying to break down the beliefs of everyone that he met. So, Soren Kierkegaard is referred to as the father of existentialism. But unfortunately, he was only famous posthumously, so he never achieved any kind of notoriety in his lifetime. So this picture is of his fiancée. Her name was Regina Olsen. Now, the day after he proposed to Regina, Soren wrote in his journal that he regretted it immediately. Because he was on an adventure of self-discovery. This is what he believed existentialism to be, was finding who you are. And he believed that he could not find out who he was fully if he were strapped in a relationship. So he called off the wedding. He was polite about it. He kind of defamed himself in the local newspaper so that people wouldn't think that it was Regina's fault, because this is a time when if your husband leaves you, your future is kind of over. So as well as he could, he attempted to protect her. And most of what we know about Soren Kierkegaard is actually not found in the text that he'd written. But instead, most of what we know about him is through journals. Something like 7,000 pages of journals that we have. And they're all published, they're all for free. Some of it's garbage, some of it's really, really interesting. And what we know is that throughout his life, he never, ever stopped loving Regina. Remember how I said that it's really hard to pin down exactly what it is that Kierkegaard actually believes? Many people believe that his entire body of work was just an indirect way to communicate to Regina how sorry he is for leaving her. Just to communicate to her that he still really misses her. At the age of 42, Soren died on November 11th, 1855. He had spent his whole life as a critic of the Christian church. This was state-run at the time in Denmark. It had a monopoly on religion. And before his death, he requested that he have a secular funeral, a secular service. If there was any kind of service, he didn't want a priest to conduct the service, but instead he wanted to have a layperson conduct the service. Well, this request unfortunately was denied, and a priest did conduct the service. There were loads of people that showed up to protest because they knew that this is not what he wanted in his life. So that is a very short introduction to the life of Soren Kierkegaard. Really interesting guy, if you get a chance to explore more about him. Any questions quickly about his life? Cool. Yeah, so he was actually meek. He was pretty frail throughout his entire life. He was constantly getting sick. He never really had a real job throughout his life. And he died of a spinal, kind of a disease in his spine. Do you actually know what it was?
No, I'm not sure what he's saying. You could please something about his
Herniated?
Yeah.
Herniated?
I don't think it was a herniated disc. No, it was actually a disease that kind of poisoned his spine. Yeah, just pretty rough. Anything else?
What is his... Did he study in university?
He did, yeah. He studied philosophy. He did study philosophy, and he did get a PhD, and he was on track to become a professor, but he never pursued this line of work. Shortly after receiving his PhD, his father died, and he came into quite a bit of an inheritance. And then he realized that he could spend the rest of his life not really working for anyone else and just writing what he felt was in his heart. So this is why we have such a huge body of work from Soren Kierkegaard, because he never had to he never had to forego his own personal ventures for working for someone else. Yeah.
It's not really about Kierkegaard, but it's you just said he didn't become a professor. It's interesting how many of the big philosophers rejected the academic establishment, like Wittgenstein did, Nietzsche did.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll talk about this a little further, but I guess for a bit of a sneak peek, he believed that the role of academic philosophy, of answering questions, that it's just not the role of philosophy, right? That philosophy should be in the business of breaking down everything that you believe. Philosophy is not in the knowledge business. It's in the recognizing how little you actually know business.
Did he study religion in his university?
Did he study theology? I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't actually know. Yeah.
Sorry, this is like a clarification of the word, like definition that philosophy is not something that's knowledge, but that is something that you should recognize. But do you think that it's not far enough? Isn't philosophy something that you should live by, not something you should just really think and you just okay, this is bad, this is good, but you don't actually live by.
Yeah, well, specifically for Kierkegaard, that was true,
Yeah,
and this is something that he was
that is
fighting
why,
against.
most of the philosophers were went crazy or have life problems and you tell them how to live.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a little ironic actually because Kierkegaard, through the end of his life, did end up telling a lot of people how to live, and he did try to come up with a theory of truth as well. But yeah, it's very true. He has a great quote. I don't remember the exact line, but basically it's something like a philosopher who stays at his desk is as useless as a philosopher who stays in the club. It's like it doesn't matter whether you're just writing or if you're going out partying every night, it's the same. You just need to be going out and legitimately experiencing life. Okay, so a quick overview of the different kinds of topics that Soren had covered within his life. One good overview, he says, a man who has a physical being always turns toward the outside, thinking that his happiness lies outside him, finally turns inward and discovers that the source is within him. It's very meditative, very Buddhist. I don't believe that Soren actually had studied any kind of Eastern philosophy, but there are echoes of a lot of Taoist principles and Zen Buddhism principles in what he says. So a few of the themes that he covers. First, he was extremely critical of the church. There's a really great story, actually, of Soren sitting outside of a church on Sunday morning, smoking and drinking coffee and saying hello to everyone as they were walking inside. And someone walked up to him and he said, "Oh, Soren, it's okay if you don't want to be here. We get it. But can you please just not make a mockery of us? Can you please just do this somewhere else?" And he said, No. I'm exactly where I want to be. So that when everyone is inside and wondering, where is Soren? Where is Soren? You'll know exactly where I am. I'm here, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. At the time, it's important to know that there was only one religion in Denmark. It was controlled by the state. It had a monopoly on religion. And this was the Christian church. There was no real freedom. And he believed that most people were Christians much more out of ritual than doing any real kind of exploring, than asking themselves the hard questions and living what he would consider to be a real Christian life. Instead, they would say their Hail Marys, they would do the prayers, they would take their communion, but it was all really without any thought. It was a herd mentality from Nietzsche. He stressed continually the importance of the single individual, and that, we'll explore this more later, but on the path towards understanding God, what God meant for Kierkegaard, much more had to do with self-discovery, with self-authorship, finding who you are, and this is the best way for you to discover God, and live a life that is in accordance with God's plan, he would say. This is all very metaphorical. Maybe it's important to say here, Soren, though he died a Christian, lived his life as a Christian, and he loved Christians and he loved the faith. He did not like the church. But his conception of God was not some bearded guy up in the sky who's throwing lightning bolts down on people, right? It was something that was far beyond what you can actually rationalize. It was something that was so far beyond what we can talk about. But he believed that we can use these stories to kind of point at something. Metaphorical. It's kind of as close to the truth as we might be able to get with our limited human faculties. Yeah? But he knew that whatever the truth is not something that we'll be able to come up with through rationalism, through intelligence, through empiricism, through study. And in fact found all of these philosophers who were attempting to come up with proofs for the existence of God, he thought that it was all futile. It's like, that's not the point of religion. That's not the point of faith. And in fact, faith is doing things in the absence of proof. Like most existentialists, and this is actually quite a bit to what you were saying, he believed that concrete human reality and human experience is far more important than just thinking, than just staying in your armchair writing and analyzing. And he said that the way that we can become self-aware is through making choices. That every time you make a hard decision, you're learning more about yourself. Most of us spend our lives attempting to not make decisions at all. We want to avoid this as much as possible. There's something called analysis paralysis that he talks about, where in the face of difficult decisions, you just freeze like deer in headlights. But that it's at these moments when we have the opportunity to actually discover who we are. And it's through these choices, and through our commitment to these choices, that we begin to experience divinity. He definitely covers a lot more. Again, he has this massive body of work. The third main text that he wrote is Either Or, which is one that we don't have here, but he wrote loads of different books. I didn't include it here just because it's not in the reading that we had, but another one of his major themes was about the aesthetic life versus the ethical life versus the religious life. So if you've heard of these terms before, that's also Kierkegaard. But these are really in line with what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Are there any questions about these themes? Or any thoughts? Yeah.
Previously you say that it's ideology reflects some of the Buddhism part of it, but it says that you have to seek something that is within of you. But then at the same time here on the second line you say when it comes to the single individual, you say that he's very supportive of the Christian ideology, which is like God is not something that is above, but it's something that you find through your own self.
Yeah, definitely.
It's basically a question. You think like maybe like seeking from within. Usually people say that it's an assumption that it's something of really Buddhist ideology, but probably it's not.
So I'd say two things here. One, for Soren, he found that there was a lot of importance in the paradoxes that arrive through faith. And that it's in the face of these extreme paradoxes that we're actually able to actualize our faith. So that's one. But also in Eastern traditions, that there are so many and they're all different, but there are many where they say that as you learn more about yourself, and as you develop yourself, you realize this lack of separation between yourself and all things. You find that who you are inside is actually this connected being, inseparable from everything else. Yeah, come. No?
How about Socratic method? Is it the same thing or?
Yeah, so the method, so the Socratic method is the method that he used where Socrates would feign Socratic ignorance. Yeah, so being Socratically ignorant is a state of mind that one can subsume, or one can assume. And then the method is the method by which you are able to get out these questions. I'm sorry that it gets a little weird, but yeah, they're basically the same thing. They're very related. Yeah. Everybody understand about this?
Maybe a good analogy is it's like playing that devil's advocate,
Yeah,
Basically,
perfect.
Maybe a good way to understand it.
Yeah, I think so too. Yep. So, Kierkegaard said, life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. So, this belief in the Socratic method and belief in feigning Socratic ignorance, this was his major problem with Hegel. So, Hegel has a huge influence on Kierkegaard, and I don't want to say that Kierkegaard disagreed with everything that Hegel said. Much of Hegel's writing you can see in Kierkegaard's work. He uses a lot of his same terminology, and that he's kind of writing for a baseline of people that have an understanding of what Hegel had already said. If we had structured this a little bit better, maybe we would have done Hegel last week. Sorry, guys. So, his major problem with Hegel was that, again, he didn't believe that philosophy was in the business of telling us anything about knowledge or truth or reality, but was by breaking it down. And this is exactly what Hegel attempted to do, and he did it in an extremely dense, extremely long-winded way. And then people would come out of this thinking, I understand everything about reality. And we walk around with this kind of pride and arrogance. And Kierkegaard was saying, no, this cuts you off from reality. This cuts you off from divinity. This kind of arrogance. And that in order to really understand reality, we have to approach it with this expectation that we don't know anything. So, Kierkegaard said, the whole of existence cannot be systematized, because existence is not yet whole. It is incomplete, and in a state of constant development. So, last week we read Nietzsche, and we heard one of my favorite philosophy disses from Nietzsche, where he's kind of commenting on the weakness of Immanuel Kant's arguments. And I really enjoyed it, and it's actually pretty common for philosophers to nag on one another. So this is what Kierkegaard says about Hegel. He says, if Hegel had completed his logic and then said in the preface that the entire thing was merely an experiment in thought, where he had even made a number of unwarranted assumptions, then he would have definitely been the greatest thinker of all time. Give me a second. definitely been that greatest thinker of all time. As it is, he is merely a joke. So he's saying, yeah, these are really great, thank you. These are really great experiments, really great ideas, but you took them seriously. You can't take these ideas seriously. They're just, there's a Zen koan, and it's, don't mistake the finger for the moon. Meaning if someone is pointing at the moon, and then all of these Christians will just spend all their time looking at the finger that's pointing in the path. Stop concentrating on the finger, and just look at the moon. Yeah? So he's saying in a way that almost Hegel is pointing on a really nice finger pointing at the moon, and people are making this mistake to think that Hegel is actually speaking the truth here. So, our next discussion will be, can rationality, logic, intellect, lead us to know anything about reality? Or is reality so elusive that we can't use these to understand reality? Okay? Any questions about anything we covered in the last section? Okay, then we have 5 minutes. Go ahead!
Yeah. Do the same thing to know that God. Like you would only agree that, okay, there is a God if I experience the same thing as you are, as you did. But it doesn't happen like that. You can know that this is a cup either by looking at it or by touching it. And either way, at the end, you know that this is the glass. But the how is different. So it's, for me, this is like a, how to say, the mixture between like rationality, logic, and intellect, and you know, something that we don't know, like reality. Something lie in between for each of us, and we use different things. Like, as I say about the box, if you try to rationalize, this is like a box. You look from different places, you see it's a squares. You look from up and down, you see it's a squares as well. So you put the pieces together and you say, you rationalize it, it's a box. But then another way for you is to just shut up and even like close your eyes and just like fucking touch it. You know? This is the box.
Oh, sorry, but we do need to move on. There will be time for more conversation later on. So another tactic that Kierkegaard used in much of his writing was what he called indirect communication, which I found pretty damn fascinating. I kind of loved it. So basically, he said there are loads of things that are really difficult to attain directly. For instance, the harder that you try to fall asleep, the less likely you are to fall asleep. The harder that you try to make somebody be friends with you, the more you push them away. The harder you try to make someone fall in love with you, the more you push them away. And similarly, when you attempt to give certain messages directly to a person, particularly about their existential being, it really pushes them away. So, he wrote a book called Concluding Unscientific Postscripts to Philosophical Fragments. And the title here is actually ironic. He's actually making fun of these really convoluted philosophers. The book was like 1,500 pages long as a joke. But he says, no, an illusion can never be destroyed directly. And only by indirect means can it be radically removed. So the illusion here is he's talking about like your conceptualization for reality, what you think reality is, and what you think your existence is. He says this cannot be removed directly. That is, one must approach from behind the person who is under an illusion. He tells a story about if someone is jogging on the road, and you try to stop them and tell them something, yeah? So they're running, and then you say, stop! They're just going to keep on running past you. But instead, if you run alongside them for a little while, this is a much better way to get this message across. So this is what he does. This is his attempt at indirect communication. Talking about something else, and through the process, he's indirectly able to get across his real idea. Yeah? Any questions about indirect communication? Yeah, Matt.
Well, what it suggests to me is, like, philosophy, or rational logical thinking seems to be a direct means to try to define things and separate them out. Nietzsche and all of like the style that they use is far more poetic, and it might be indirect because it can mean like 4 things at once versus trying to pinpoint one. So maybe that influences his style. I haven't read enough of his stuff to determine that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think that all of these guys would recognize the natural limitations of language, and they know that language puts ideas into a box. And if we attempt to communicate something directly, then the idea is certainly put into a box. If we're attempting to talk about God, which is the transcendental thing that can't be put into a box, then we necessarily can't use rigid language in order to describe it, which is where things like the poetic and the metaphorical actually start to come in, as it attempts to indirectly talk about our experiences of the divine. So Kierkegaard actually used many different pseudonyms. You might have noticed in the reading that we did that the Sickness Unto Death was written by a pseudonym called Anticlimacus, and Fear and Trembling was written by someone called Johannes de Silentio, which is John of the Silence. Yeah, and he had these characters repeating throughout many of his different works. He would frequently write many different books at the same time, arguing opposing opinions about the same subject. And then he would release them on the same date under these different pseudonyms, and nobody knew. It just seemed like three totally different people arguing about these things. So it's very difficult to really understand what Kierkegaard means when he speaks. We're going to be talking in a little bit about the story of Abraham and Isaac, which is the central story that's being discussed in Fear and Trembling. So I really like this picture. Here's Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac. Here's Kierkegaard and the angel, kind of this like magnificent beam saying, "No, stop, stop." So when Kierkegaard, in his journals, he said that he doesn't consider himself to be a philosopher, but he actually considers himself to be a poet. And again, perhaps we consider poetry to be this thing where we're not communicating messages directly. You know, if I tell you how beautiful you are, it might scare you away. But instead, I can tell you how beautiful a flower is. And through the process, I can indirectly communicate to you how much I love you. And that won't push you away. And this is maybe what he saw his role in philosophy to be. Also, I'm sorry, I meant to say this before, Matt, I think that he would say that much of this analysis and rationalization and these attempts to discover the truth. So we're fighting for this goal, discover the truth, discover the truth, discover the truth. And through this process, indirectly, we actually come to the conclusion, there is no objective truth. Yeah? This indirect approach to come to that conclusion. Okay, so again, it's very, very difficult to know what Kierkegaard actually means for several reasons. So first of all, yeah, he used a lot of different pseudonyms. He didn't start publishing under his own name until much later on in his life. And a lot of these pseudonyms would have conflicting arguments. He used Socratic irony a lot, so he would ask questions, and you don't really know if he doesn't know the answer, or if he's just using this ironically. You don't know. He would use indirect communication, and again, the kind of most fascinating one of all of these is that many people believe that most of his writing was just a message to Regina, to explain to her how much he misses her and how difficult it is to bear existence without her in his life. Maybe he would say this is a message that he could not communicate to her directly. So instead, he used this method of indirect communication, making all of these publications, these massive texts, spending his whole life just to get this message across. Any questions about any of these?
Did she read any texts?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, cool. So now, I'd like to get into Fear and Trembling. So, again, the pseudonym that Kierkegaard used was Johannes de Silentio, John of the Silence. This is a painting depicting the sacrifice of Isaac. This is Abraham, Isaac's father, and an angel who at the last minute tells Abraham not to sacrifice his son. So the basic story goes a bit like this. This is a relatively newer painting, actually, from the 20th century, early 20th century, by a gentleman called Harold Copping. So the basic story, it's one of the oldest stories in all existence, actually. It's extremely old. We find it in all of the Abrahamic religions. So this is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it's one of the very first stories in the Quran, and in the Torah, and in the Bible. In the Bible, it is all depicted in Genesis 22, and it's only 3 paragraphs long. Abraham is considered to be one of the foundational characters of all of Christianity, a person whom after all Christians should attempt to replicate their lives. But it's just 3 paragraphs where we get across all this information, you know. Similarly, I don't know if you've read the Bible, the story of Noah is like a single paragraph. Noah and the flood and the ark and all, 1 paragraph. So there's been so much commentary on these stories to help us understand what it is that's going on. As I said, it's one of the oldest stories in existence. Here we see the floor is a mosaic. This is from a synagogue in Israel that we believe is from the 6th century. So, 500 years after the death of Christ, we find this on the floor in this mosaic. I mean, it's beautiful. And we see, well, in a second it'll be beautiful. Here we see Abraham. We'll go into the story. If you're not familiar, we'll go into the story in just a second, actually. But here we see Abraham, and he's holding Isaac here on top of a fire that he's about to sacrifice him towards. Here's a goat that was caught in a bush, and here are the angels coming to stop Abraham from sacrificing his son. So the basic story of Abraham and Isaac goes like this. For all of their lives together, Abraham and Sarah were unable to have children. Could I get a quick hand raise, actually? Who knows the story of Abraham and Isaac? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, yeah, a couple of us. Cool. Yeah, great. Okay, so this will be a good review, and new for everybody else. So God came to Abraham, and Abraham was so sad that he could not have children. God came to Abraham, and he said, Abraham, how many stars are there in the sky? Socratic ignorance. He said, how many stars are there in the sky? And Abraham said, I don't know. And God said, well, you will have more children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren than all of the stars in the sky. Abraham was 100 years old by the time Sarah had conceived their first son. They'd been waiting and waiting and waiting, faithful to God. And this first son's name was Isaac. So I'd like to read you a bit. I've condensed these 3 paragraphs down a bit to make them a bit more digestible. So this is from the Bible, Genesis 22. And this is the reason that we're doing this, because this is what Kierkegaard mostly wrote about in his book, Fear and Trembling, was analyzing this story and understanding it. And this is the foundations of existentialism. The Lord spoke to Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. As they walked to Mount Moriah, Isaac asked his father, Father, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham turned to his son and said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked along together. When they came to the place that God had showed him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from him. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So that is the basic story of Abraham and Isaac. And it's this act that for centuries people have been saying, it's this man that we're supposed to be modeling our lives after. This is the level of devotion that we should be attempting to replicate in our own lives. Are there any questions about the narrative of the story? Okay. Once again, this mosaic from the 6th century. This is a painting by Titian. 1542. The moment when the angel intervened. Yeah.
Will Abraham become the father of the thousands, millions, sons?
Yeah, so the story of Abraham and Isaac is only 3 paragraphs long, but Abraham is a figure that's written about extensively within the Old Testament. Yeah, so his story continues. The story of Isaac and his brother continue throughout the Bible, throughout the Old Testament, and many of their offspring. It's just this story that's condensed.
What is his role with Abraham in the context of religion?
Yeah. So it's said that it's Abraham's children are the chosen children of God. Yeah, and this is all Jews today are considered descendants of Abraham, and that they are his chosen people. Are there any Jews in the audience who wants to correct that for me? Everybody good? Okay, yeah. I'm not Jewish myself, but I believe that's the case. Another one by a gentleman called Caravaggio from 1603. I love the colors in this and the expression on Isaac's face. And what is really being communicated here in the paintings, as well as in the story, is the emotional state of the character of Abraham. It's not just that he felt obligated to God, but he felt these two conflicting emotions. On one hand, he knew that it was unethical to kill his son. On the other hand, he had made a covenant with God. He made a promise to God. (1627) by a gentleman called Domenichino. So, next round of discussions. Have you ever taken a leap of faith? Was there ever a moment in your life when you had an extreme feeling, what we might call a message from God, to take a particular path, that went against reason, went against logic and analysis, but you had to take this leap anyway? So we have 5 minutes. For Kierkegaard, it's important to say that the role of faith is important, and its importance is found in the fact that you don't know. What you're doing, there's no justification for, and that acting without justification is exactly the role of faith. That there's something that's gained through the process of releasing your own intellect, releasing your own judgment, and simply going to God's will. There's a common notion in marriage and in love, which is to say that if you wait until you're certain to find love, you'll never find love. And that an important aspect of getting married, thank you, that an important aspect of getting married, or an important aspect of finding a partner, is that you don't know whether or not it will work out. And there's a real psychological or spiritual change that happens to a person when you take this leap of faith. And most of us today live in a world where we're pretty damn certain. We have Google Maps to show us exactly how we're supposed to get to our next destination. We have the ability to contact each other at all times. We know where all of our loved ones are, always. Very rarely do we have to take a leap of faith anymore. And in Kierkegaard's time, most of the Christians were just following their rote, prescribed rituals without really having to make any choices on their own. And he's saying that because these people are no longer required to make a leap of faith, they're just following the herd, no one is battling them, that they're not experiencing real Christianity, and that the real value of Christianity is found in taking this leap of faith. Any questions about that?
So to clarify, when you say Christianity, because Kierkegaard viewed that as being a part of oneself, should we just translate that as being like a human, like a good person.
Great. So it's important to say here that in Kierkegaard's time, the way that Kierkegaard talks about Christianity, he's using the term synonymously to religion. Because in Denmark at the time, there was no other religion. If he were around today and had access to all of these different religious texts, I'm sure that his writing would be very, very different. But at the time, Christianity was the only one. Now, he loved Christians, a lot of them. He really liked their goals. And he loved the idea of following Christ, specifically the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount in Christianity, a disciple comes to Jesus and he says, what is the most important law to follow in all of the laws that have been given to us by God? And Jesus says, love your brother as you love yourself. That's number one. That's Jesus to Kierkegaard. Yeah? So all of the extra rituals and traditions of Christianity, the hierarchical structure within the church, this is something that Kierkegaard is very against. He likes the Christian faith, but not the Christian institution. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Is he a Protestant?
I don't know. I don't really know very much about the delineation between Catholicism and Protestantism in Denmark at the time.
Protestant,
Yeah. Definitely Protestant.
He's from Denmark.
Yeah.
Did he claim some way to know the will of God? Or how did he... I mean, the story of Abraham doesn't happen to most people. So,
Yeah.
what is the will of God and how,
Yeah.
how does he try to find it and live it?
For sure. So, if someone were to say to you, God has you in his hands, you certainly don't think that there's actually a man who has you in his hands, right? This is clearly a kind of metaphorical statement, yeah? And the degree to which you're able to analyze different religious scriptures through metaphor is like really varying and actually causes a lot of problems, right? One of the problems of the poetic model, or speaking indirectly about things, is that it can be interpreted in so many different ways. But for Kierkegaard, it doesn't appear as though he believes that when in the Bible it says, the Lord spoke unto Abraham, that there was actually a thing that looked like a human that used words to communicate this to him, right? But there was something else, some other sign, something that was drawing Abraham that he just knew. He knew that for God's will, he had to sacrifice his son. And unfortunately in the Bible, it just doesn't go into any more detail than what I had read. Yeah. But I'm sure that many of us have experienced in our own lives just this feeling. And you can, cast this off to some kind of psychological process or subconscious process if you want to. But this is John talking here. I would say we really still don't really know. We're trying to get a grasp of it, but we don't know a lot of how these impulses come to us. Why is it that we like the color green? We don't really know why we prefer things. Yeah. Or why we're drawn to certain things. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like using religion is a way of indirect communication, but he's like against that, but he somehow kind of support that indirect kind of communication. So what he criticized in Christianity, can you go more specific on what he really kind of criticized on Christianity?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
As a whole, it's like an indirect communication.
Well, certainly in the West today, I'm pretty sure that most pagodas in Vietnam are state-sanctioned, and that most, at least in the north, that most of the Buddhist institutions are controlled in part by the state. So this was a similar problem that was existing in Kierkegaard's time, that the Danish state was controlling the religion. And maybe the other way around as well, but there was a real partnership and political control. Kierkegaard once said, if the Christian church had found out that Jesus was in fact not the Son of God, that the priests would not the priests, but the pastors would continue to preach this same message because it gave them power and it gave them control. So it was the kind of arrogance, the power-mongering, the fear-mongering that Kierkegaard was really against. Also the money. So he would make all of these in one of his journals he wrote about how in the Bible it says it's easier for it's easier for a man to fit a camel through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And yet, when the pastor is saying this thing, he does it with these golden rings on his fingers, these golden chains around his neck, going back to his palace home, There was this real hypocrisy that existed in the church and didn't believe that the church represented Christ's word at all. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, cool. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the analysis of the Abrahamic and Isaac story within Fear and Trembling. So most of Fear and Trembling is an analysis of Abraham and Isaac. Now, Kierkegaard actually shows 4 different stories. This is in the first section, we didn't read this one together. But it starts with 4 different versions of the Abrahamic story. In the first version, Abraham tells Isaac that it's Abraham's idea, that it's not God's idea. And he does this because he doesn't want his son to lose faith in God, but instead he wants his son to blame him. Yeah? That's the first version. In the second version, Abraham backs down. He doesn't sacrifice Isaac, and instead he just sacrifices a ram. He's not strong enough to actually uphold the covenant that he had established with God. In the third version, he decides not to kill Isaac. He also doesn't sacrifice a ram. Instead, he just hikes back off the mountain. Then in the fourth version, similar, but at the end, Isaac begins to question his own faith because he sees that his father did not fulfill the covenant that he had made with God. Now, there's a really interesting allegory here that's made between these 4 different stories, these 4 different versions of the stories, and the 4 different versions of Christ's story, which is told through the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Right? The idea is that by showing 4 different versions of the same story, we see the differences, but we're also able to see the similarities, and we're able to find truth in the areas that overlap between these 4 different stories. In each one, the actual narrative changes slightly, but what remains the same is the emotional state of Abraham and how tormented he is by this decision of whether or not to kill Isaac. And because this is the same, it's highlighted. So Abraham's anxiety is highlighted through showing these 4 different versions of the story. That makes sense to everybody? So most of the anxiety was caused because there was this kind of paradox that Abraham was facing. He knew on one end that killing Isaac was ethically wrong, but he also knew that he had made a covenant with God, and it was important to uphold this covenant. A covenant just means promise, by the way. It's a really intense promise. This painting here is Persian. It's we believe it's from the year 1410 in Persia. So this is when Kierkegaard begins to talk about the leap of faith. This is a term, it may have begun with Goethe, the playwright. Kierkegaard did not invent the term leap of faith, but it's often associated when talking about Kierkegaard. So he distinguishes faith from religion. He distinguishes faith from belief by saying that belief is when you really know that something is going to happen. If I drop this microphone, I know that it's going to make a noise, right? There's no doubt in my mind. But if I were to, get married to a girl, I don't really know if she is going to love me for the rest of her life. But it's important that I take this leap of faith. By stepping blindly into the unknown, I'm able to get something else through the process. The first section that we had looked at, first problema. Problema means an angle through which you can analyze a particular story. And we had read the 2 problemas in Fear and Trembling. So he asked the question, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? So teleological, it means regard to the end or the goal. So it's saying, teleological means in reference to the eventual goal that we're attempting to achieve. And then suspension means to momentarily pause. So a teleological suspension of the ethical means, are we advised through the story of Abraham to momentarily pause what's considered to be the ethical, right? Don't kill your son. Are we able to momentarily pause this so that we're able to better meet the actual goal, so that we're able to better meet the actual telos? It's a really intimidating sentence, I think, and it's how it all starts, and it's really intense to look at this and be like, what the hell is he saying? So I wanted to break that down. Do you guys, did I do an okay job breaking down what this sentence actually means, what this idea is? Okay. So Abraham is able to prove his faith in God by putting God's commandments above ethical concerns. Of course it was wrong to kill your son at the time. This was not so long ago that there weren't, well, I actually don't know if there were really strict laws about this kind of thing, but it was certainly unethical. And Abraham knew this, and this was the real dilemma. Kierkegaard says that prayer does not change God, but it changes him who prays. And perhaps we could say something similar about sacrifice. That making a sacrifice of an animal, or a sacrifice of your crop, or a sacrifice of your son, that this isn't actually changing the way that God acts towards you, but instead it changes you. It has real psychological power. Maybe to take this path seriously, or something, right? We don't really have many practices of sacrifice in our culture today. Back then, it was really common. And we find that through all traditional cultures, I don't want to say all, through loads of traditional cultures, we find sacrifice as being a very important part of the faith. The question is, what is the role of sacrifice? What does it do for us? Why is it so important that all of these different traditions had sacrifice as a key element of the practice? Most of what Kierkegaard wrote about was angst, anxiety. And this is the psychological state that you encounter when you're presented with a dilemma, when you're presented with different choices, and you just don't know which is the best option to choose. Now, Kierkegaard argues that it's through the process of answering these difficult questions, through the process of making a choice, that you actualize yourself. And only an individual is able to approach God. Only an actualized individual is able to approach God. So by answering these questions, we're able to come closer to God. In much of his writing in Fear and Trembling, he's talking about the difference between blind obedience and faith. So he's saying, if Abraham were to simply believe that God would have, killed Abraham or something for not killing Isaac, that this wouldn't really be faith. Instead, this isn't in the Bible anywhere, but Kierkegaard says that the whole time, Abraham actually knew that God, at the last second, would intervene. Right? And this is exactly what happened, actually. At the very last second, the angel came to intervene. So belief is when we know something to be certain, and faith is when we could be wrong. Kierkegaard says to have faith is to lose your mind and to win God. Much of Kierkegaard's writing on Christianity revolved around what he considered to be the Christian paradox, which we find in a lot of different Christian scriptures that are self-contradictory. And many people, philosophers in particular, attempt to bridge these divides. Kierkegaard says, no. It's actually in the paradox that we're able to find truth, we're able to find meaning, we're able to find faith. Relatively similar, again, to some traditions in the East, that Zen Buddhism relies a lot on paradoxes, on presenting two conflicting ideas. He says that ethical systems are meant to help people. Sometimes, ethical systems, though, harm people. Humans don't know the outcomes of our actions. So it's actually kind of impossible for us to suss out what the long-term outcome. We think we're doing something good, but we don't really know. And sometimes we're kind of paralyzed by this inability to make a decision. we don't know the best way to achieve the real goal. And maybe we don't even really know what the goal is. But through faith, we're able to overcome this ethical paradox. We just have faith in God that it'll be okay. This paradox seems to present itself, and we just release and we say, okay, God is going to take over. God is going to take the steering wheel. And through this, we're able to release ourselves from the psychological dilemma that we find ourselves in through this paradox. This is one of my favorite paintings about Abraham and Isaac. It's 1997. It's an etching by a German called Adi Holzer, which I think is just beautiful, really beautiful. Again, faith in God is able to solve this paradox. It's about to get a little brainy, and I'm sorry. And if you don't understand, please let me know. I'm going to try to do a good job, but this slide is just a little intense. There are a lot of terms. How are we doing so far? Everybody with me okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much. Yeah,
Can you re-explain the teleological suspension?
Yes, yeah. So, teleos means the goal. What's sometimes referred to as the end. So it's the end goal. What it is that you're attempting to achieve. When something is considered to be teleological, we're saying it is understood in terms of its goal. So we say, I'm hungry, therefore I'm going to eat food. I am eating food because I am hungry and I want to satisfy my stomach. When I think about eating, I'm thinking about satisfying my stomach. Yeah? There's a goal. I think about food teleologically. Other times we might eat and we don't really think about the goal. Maybe we are just doing it through ritual because we eat 3 times a day. Then it's not teleological. Right? Okay. So then, suspension means to say to momentarily stop. So a teleological suspension of ethics means to momentarily stop our ethics for the sake of the goal. Right? Maybe it's ethically wrong to kill a person, but we can all imagine a circumstance where killing a person might be the right thing to do, even though it's ethically wrong. Yeah? That makes sense? Cool. So that's what Abraham is coming up here, and he's saying that maybe the times when we're able to suspend this is if God is actually commanding us to do it, to prove our faith. Yeah? Cool. So, okay. Yeah, go on.
So, do you think that teleological
Perfect.
is telos in Aristotle?
Same thing. Yep. Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. Actually, in the reading that we had, there was a Greek word that just kept on appearing, and that word was teleos. Right. Yeah. So through faith, Kierkegaard says, we're able to believe that even an unethical action will actually result in a better end. And remember, thank you for dealing with me. This is the foundation of existentialism, which has had massive impacts on the whole world. And it's funny that it goes here. I know that maybe a lot of us weren't expecting it to get so religious in this way, but this is the foundation. Yeah. So thank you for sticking with me through this. So Kierkegaard says that through the process of attempting to make these decisions, there's loads of anxiety that begins to arise. And he says that anxiety maybe is a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because it shows that we're establishing a correct relationship with the divine, with the transcendent. If you don't feel comfortable with the word God, you can say the universe, or energy, or that which is beyond what we're able to experience. Yeah, I think is much more in line with what Kierkegaard actually believes about God than some guy in the sky.
Faith can't be our certainty unless what that really means, and maybe what his point is that we must always be uncertain, and that is what a good existence is. It's that painful, just always not being sure, but trust, just going with.
Leap of faith. I think it's this. I don't agree with that.
Faith is more like a journey, and so when you say that you just jump to a leap of faith, I think it's very hard. It's not it's somewhere that you don't go down. It's like judo jump. You jump, but at one point you just don't hit the spot anymore, and you just fell down. I just don't trust this shit. I'm going to drop it. So it's definitely not something that you just jump there and you just never go down again. I think it's very healthy faith for you to doubt. Faith are meant to be doubt until you cannot doubt it anymore.
I think that is a situation that we the descriptions of some very difficult situation we have to make some choice.
Much of Kierkegaard's work was a response to Hegel. And if you're familiar, Hegel had written, you've probably heard of the terms the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. That there is an idea, culture of morals, that everyone is acting on. And then there's an argument to this, yeah? And then we're able to find a synthesis between the two. And he says that
My hands are not.
the best life is one that is actually acting within this kind of synthesis between the two, just following what society says is right. And Kierkegaard is saying, no, we have to fight against this goal, and that real closeness to God is not following the herd. Real closeness to God is not just lying within this synthesis, lying within these overlapping sections of the Venn diagram, but instead, if we look at ourselves, we analyze ourselves, we ask these tough questions, we're able to find out who we really are and what our faith is going to be looking like. Yeah? And this is how we become closer to God.